All right. What's going on, Dane? How you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Man, we're getting into the season, man. It's almost end of the year. Christmas is around the corner. Just had Thanksgiving, so kind of it's pedal to the metal until at least for another 3 weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels like there's two types of people. You're either kind of tapering off towards the end of the year or it's ramping up. And I feel like I'm in the ramp up
Yeah,
phase.
yeah, yeah.
You know?
Now, is that typical for you, or are you kind of a ramp up guy in general, or do you seem to like, hey, I have some time where, hey, let me just chill because I know next year's going to be a crazy
No, I'm
mess.
I'm not very good at chill, to be
Yeah,
honest with you. I'm
yeah.
I'm kind of a ramp up guy by nature, but I do enjoy the holidays. I'm looking forward to it for
That's
sure.
awesome. Yeah, like every time we go on a vacation that includes the beach, I feel like you ever watch that movie Accepted? It was old,
Yeah.
yeah, with the where they start their own college and everything was great, right? And I feel like I'm that 80 at that ADHD guy that he's like going to yoga class. He's like, he sits down, he's like, okay, I'm done, like I'm good.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
that's kind of how
Exactly.
I feel on vacations because I'm like, let me go do something. So let's go hiking, let's go surfing, let's do something, right? That's more active.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. So we'll pack everything that we can into vacation. And
Yeah.
actually, on the topic of AI, ChatGPT has been the best travel planner for us in the last
Really?
year or so. Yeah,
No, so okay, so let's unpack that a little bit, and no pun
yep.
intended. But I'd be interested. So, are you using it to like for agenda items and whatnot? Are you looking for like total planning? Um,
Yeah,
how are you using that?
yeah. So when we go on vacations, we'll try and do like more than a week in whatever location that we go to, so that we
That's
really get
great.
the experience. We try not to go to multiple places twice, and so what I've been doing is I'll say, "Hey, I'm interested in going to this place from these dates. Plan the most like I guess popular tourist attractions over the course of this week. Group them by location. So an example is we went to New York, and I was like, group them
Okay.
by location, so we're not like going all around the city. Um, and it does a really good job of just kind of
Nice.
suggesting an itinerary, and
That's
that
awesome.
way, that's like the place that I start from for research. So I'm not just like handing it all over, to ChatGPT or whatever, but
Yeah.
it is super helpful. It saves me, hours of time, researching a place and figuring out what people go
Oh,
look at.
that's awesome. Yeah, because I always feel like the transition between working and trying to plan a vacation, it's always you're always trying to juggle so many different things, and it's
Absolutely, yeah,
interesting how most of life is just all transitions, right? We go from one transition to another. It
yeah.
doesn't really stop.
Well, the cool thing too is you can ask it like, okay, so this is pretty like touristy. Can you give me some examples of things that locals do, or
Yeah,
so that's the thing I really like about it is that
that's
it
cool.
allows you to really customize towards whatever it is that you like, which is exciting.
Yeah, because before you'd have to go buy the books that are like this thick and then try to figure it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, you're
Yeah,
you're reading an encyclopedia before you go wherever you.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny. So speaking of transitions, you've kind of had actually we both have had some transitions this year, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
and yours has been I think 2 months ago. Is it now about two
Two or
months or
three,
is it almost on 3 months? But yeah, 2 3 months. I made that transition back in May to leave the corporate and world and start my own. And so you've moved from Coke to Squint AI,
yeah, yep,
and I like to that's the kind of the one of the biggest or largest companies in America, privately owned, right, down to a startup.
yep,
And again, I can kind of relate to that because I worked for a huge global company down to just me, and so
yeah.
me and a couple of contractors, and that's about it right now. And so it's been interesting. I love to kind of walk through that because I think what I find curious is um, I'm not the only one that goes through this. I think you're seeing a trend. I've seen a trend, not just you and I spoke earlier about this, but this idea that people are starting to see. Wait, you used to relate this big idea, big impact to big companies, and
Mhm.
now you're seeing a shift. And I think AI has some role to play in this. But I think
Absolutely.
you're starting to see a shift where now smaller companies are able to have maybe just as big of an impact. I'd be curious to see kind of your thinking behind that transition and kind of what made you do that.
Yeah, well, so for me, I worked in manufacturing for almost a decade, and I absolutely loved it. Like, I love the people. I felt like every day I was going to work, and it was how it's made, right? Like, I got
Yeah,
the opportunity to see how all these different things that we made, impacted people's lives, and how we like the actual processes that were involved. Which I'm an engineer by background, and so
Yeah.
that's like all super fascinating to me. The trend that started to emerge that kind of got me thinking about making the transition was um, this retirement wave that we're seeing across manufacturing, well, in industry as a whole. And a lot of these companies, I think it was LNS Research did some pretty interesting, or they did an interesting study where it was like uh, 2019, like the average tenure for somebody in manufacturing was like 20 years, and then in 2023 it was like 3 years, right?
Wow.
So like the drop off is crazy, and the challenge is manufacturing is highly contextual. It's highly reliant on the experience that people have, and so the kind of like the flag that went off in my head is like, wow, there's a lot of people who know a lot of stuff
Yeah.
today,
Sure.
and they're going to be gone, sipping from a coconut on a beach in Mexico somewhere, in the next couple of years in retirement. And
Yeah.
so how do we start to think about kind of institutionalizing the knowledge that are in people's heads, and making it accessible for the folks that come behind them? And what's
Yeah.
interesting too is like a lot of the folks that they have 30 or 40 years, they trained reading out of books, or
Mhm.
talking to like a senior employee. And I don't know if how many 19-year-olds are wanting to read from a book on how you refine oil, or
Yeah.
whatever. Like there's not many of them, and so
Yeah.
we have to shift the modalities of learning to the modalities that make the most sense for the folks that are actually going to be doing the learning. And so that was a big shift for me,
Sure.
was kind of seeing that as a problem, and then realizing like I need to really focus on this as a solution. And obviously AI is a big part of that.
Yeah. One of the things I tend to, I don't know, I struggle with, because I feel like at one point you've got the textbook readers, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of, especially if you're reading the updated textbook,
Yep.
every time they come with a new version, right? So it's like, oh, I'm like, I remember when I was in school, sometimes I'd get like version 2, and I needed version 3 because it was
Yep.
cheaper.
Yeah,
And I was like, I'll
absolutely. Yeah.
just fill in the gaps. We'll just figure it out. It was like, that's
Yeah.
$100, $100
Yeah.
difference. So let me go ahead
Absolutely.
and get the earlier version. But I feel like sometimes there's a lot of context in there, and if
Yep.
you actually do take the time to read it, you're going to probably be more equipped to speak about and do whatever that is that you're reading about than
Mhm.
maybe a headliner, right? Because we read news now where you used to say, okay, newspapers, magazines, all these, right? The headliners used to be just hey, let me just entice you enough to read the article. Now we just take that and say, okay, we know what we're talking about. We get a headline and we think we know everything that's going to say, and we move on. And we
Yeah.
make and formulate all of our opinions and everything, all of our assumptions based off the headline and not the actual article itself. I'm curious how that actually plays, and maybe what some adjustments you've seen that you're having to make within either the company you're working for or just in general in the industry, because I feel like that's going to be are we just creating these workers, these employees that are just reading headlines because
Yeah.
that's what they want, versus what does the actual business need?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways we could go here. One is I think there's lots of different ways that people learn, right? And there's a
Mhm.
ton of research on this. I think podcasts are a great example of like a
Sure.
relatively new media style that I use a ton. To listen to. Yeah, I just listened to the Anthropic
Yeah.
CEO with Lex Friedman, this week. So
Yeah.
I think there's an incredible value in having kind of verbal listening media that people can listen to while they're doing other things.
Hmm.
Visuals. So the team that I came from at Coke, like we built virtual reality trainings, to help people be able to actually go and get some reps on a particular thing that they were trying to train on. And we saw,
Yeah.
training times drop from like 6 to 8 months to like a couple weeks, right? And
Nice.
so
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge that we're also trying to address. It's not just like helping people to learn it. It's like how fast can you get people to a capacity that they can contribute back to the business.
Yeah.
And so I think yeah, I think for every piece of content or every task that you want to teach, you really have to have 4 or 5 different modalities of content that people can ingest depending on what they see as valuable.
Yeah.
I also think culturally with the rise of AI and the rise of ChatGPT, and I don't know if you've seen like HeyGen where they'll do like the face map and
Yeah.
like
It's crazy.
yeah, it's crazy. And I think culturally we'll have to shift to, by default, we kind of trust the things that we see right now.
Mhm.
And I think it's getting less that way.
I
But
know.
I do think that people in general default to trusting what they see. And I think we'll have to go to a future where the default is that people don't trust what they see and they only trust the things that come from valid sources. And so I don't know if you've seen any of the conversation around like using blockchains to validate posts
I
and
have,
stuff.
yeah, and it's interesting because blockchain was a huge hype buzzword, a couple years back, and everybody kind of was, this is great, and it's like, what do we do with it? And it was really just more around the Bitcoin kind of hype
Yep.
as well, right? And now you're starting to see, okay, well now this makes sense. Like same thing with VR, right? The VR AR space, it was that kind of came out earlier, and now with AI, it's like, oh wait, well we kind of had to wait till AI was here
Yeah.
and really here before those other systems made sense because it really kind of helped each other out. It was an ecosystem that was being created that I don't think a lot of people connected the dots early on. So I
Yeah.
think it's interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like having augmented reality without AI is like having a TV without volume or something,
Sure,
like you kind of
sure.
need multiple modalities for it to actually make sense and to for the context to be real. And so I think that's where you're right, like the large language model kind of, big large transformer capability really started to kind of shift a lot of these industries that and it's funny too because like even back then you could look at it and go like we have pieces parts
Yeah.
of this whole
Yep.
thing.
Exactly.
um, and so that was the thing that a lot of people are worried about AI, but that was one of the things that has always been really helpful to me is to just kind of look at the broader landscape of technology and kind of realize like wow, we have blockchain which allows you to authenticate in a trustless way.
Hmm.
We have augmented reality and virtual reality which allows you to contextualize in a digital or in a physical space. So we're probably not actually at as high of risk as people recognize, or if you're just looking at like the AI space, in and of itself. So that's kind of interesting. It'll
Yeah.
likely be an ecosystem of tools that are
Sure.
important.
It always is, right? It's never just a single
Yeah.
thing that takes over. Regardless of what any industrial revolution that we're talking about, it's always been more than one thing, right?
Yep.
We talked about manufacturing and automation. One of the things I think is interesting too is when people talk about automation and AI, they often refer to machines taking over tasks. And we're talking
Yeah.
about that. That's kind of what you're in right now. But I
Yep.
think you've got a unique perspective on this since you focus a lot on the relationship between human intelligence and technology.
Mhm.
Where do you see AI helping to redefine human engagement with work?
Yeah, I mean, I already see it with myself, right? Like ChatGPT is my thought partner on a lot of the things. I work in product for Squint, and so I'm
Hmm.
responsible for kind of a subset of our roadmap and the features that our customers and the priority in which we build and all that stuff. And ChatGPT is an incredible thought partner for me, where I can just say like, hey, this is how I'm thinking about this problem. Like, give me the straw man argument to this
Sure.
problem, and I can kind of argue my own ideas with myself without in a my own microcosm, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like a fascinating thing because a lot of it's been like you had to ideate, you had to interact with all these different people. And so I think ChatGPT is really helpful from that perspective. I will say I think I'm less, maybe I'll say I'm skeptical of the whole concept of like robots are going to replace all like blue collar
Yeah.
workers that are working in a plant type of thing. um,
I get
you
that.
know, one of the prior projects that I worked on was thinking about like how do we automate a manufacturing process that we had, and it was designed for people. And like we thought about like could you get a robot arm that can go and do this whole process, can you do like a cart that moves around.
Hmm.
And in some cases I think there's just they're designed for people, and so it's really hard to kind of force a cobot or whatever into a space that's designed for people. And so I think the reality is that we'll have to it's a symbiotic relationship where like companies will have to make investments that allow for cobots to be effective. It's not just going to be like, yep, drop in your figure, robot or whatever, and it
Yeah.
walks around and does your
Well,
job.
I mean,
But
that's one of the reasons why the Tesla Optimus looks like a human, right? There's
yep,
humanoids, right?
yep,
K-Pax, the movie K-Pax with
yeah,
yeah. And he's like, "Well, why do you look like us?" And he's like, "Well, this is the most efficient
to
form."
mirror, yeah,
And that kind of relates to AI and humanoids as well. It's like why do humans relate so much of artificial intelligence to the way that we think? Why are we looking at neural links and the connections that exist and trying to replicate that for artificial intelligence the same way human intelligence works? It's because, well, we're comfortable with that. We know that. But I think it's interesting that when we talk about automation, I can't help to think that we're also talking about removing choice.
yeah.
So when we put humans in a place to be automated, are
Hmm.
we actually removing choice? And I think I'll just leave it at that. I think that's a really interesting concept, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I think if you phrase it a different way, choice is just variability, right? Because you put five people in a room and each one's going to make a different choice depending on kind of what their background is and context and all those things. And so I think automation is really helpful, from a quality perspective, if you can automate certain things because, you remove that, variability. But I
But we're
also
also
think,
talking about strategy per se, right? Versus doing a task. If you're
yeah,
if you're a worker in a machine shop, you
mhm,
are there to you have widgets, you build your widgets, and you need those widgets to be the same widget every time.
yep,
And so the automation then therefore takes out choice. And
mhm,
so I mean, I had put some notes around because I think that there's let me should pull it up here because I have some notes around the I was looking up workers and automation and kind of when was a tipping point, when was that turning point, or if you will, of when we went from everybody's kind of doing their own thing to, hey, this makes sense. And it was 1700s. It was before a lot of
wow,
it was around the water frame. So
uh-huh,
before it was Robert, let me look at it. It was really interesting when I was looking this up the other day. His name is Robert. Oh, and I can't. I'll find it in a minute. But his name was Robert, and I'm sure someone watching this will probably be able to like chat and comment about all the stuff that were wrong with it. But back in the 1700s, there was a rise of factory workers because of immigration to England,
mm,
and the water frame was created because they were like, hey, we can do more with water on the river, and we can get more horsepower out of water than we can horses, right? So we're going to go
mhm,
ahead and move this over. Well, they had a huge immigration migration to England. I think it was like Bristol at the time. And so
mhm,
what they did was they said, look, we need something to give these people jobs,
mhm,
and they're unskilled. So what are we going to do? We're going to give them factory work, and we're going to tell them you're going to do this. It's going to be, and it was all winding up yarns and cotton and stuff, right? It was kind of the big thing back then, and that's what they did. And there were stories high of it because of the way the water frame worked. But that was like kind of the introduction of factory workers. And when I started looking at this story a while back, I kept on thinking, yeah, but there's automation in our nature, right? We have the sun goes up and down.
yep,
It's depending on where you live in the world, because sometimes that's not always true, but for us, it's true. but there's other things in nature that are consistent, and I think our environments, as a human species, we like that consistency. We like automation because we're comfortable
yep,
with it. We have some know with it. We have some control, right, with it. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is the control. So when we talk about factory workers and automation, and we talk about AI and the assistance and the enhancements and helping, are we really providing a way to still give choice? And what does that look like? Are we still saying you have to make a widget and you have to make it look like this? What roles do people still play 5 years from now that maybe lets them still be a factory worker? But how does that factory worker not have the same exact role that they had? I think that's the difference, is the roles are changing, but I don't know if we're catching up yet. And maybe you can speak to that with your experience working with some of the manufacturing as well.
yeah. It's interesting too. So like, just like I do this as a thought experiment for myself. It's like, okay, so and this is not pragmatic because this is not the reality that we live in, right?
Sure.
But like imagine that like energy costs go to zero, that we're incredible at manufacturing everything, so the cost of things go to zero. It's like an automated world.
Okay.
I do feel like there's a world where like people still want to buy things made by people.
Sure.
It's funny,
Sure.
like you see like handmade goods and all kinds of stuff, and
Hmm.
so I think there'll be a bit of a renaissance actually of things that are imperfect, but they are made by somebody, and or they're unique, specifically to a person,
Hmm.
and so it's interesting to think about like the dichotomy of that. Like people pay more for something that's arguably less.
Sure.
Um, you know, uh, I guess regular or however you want to put it. But so I think that's an interesting thing that like we'll kind of
Unless it's
see.
fruit or veggies, right? You go to the store, you want your red bell
Yeah,
peppers to
that's
look
true.
red and luscious. You want your apples to look crisp. It doesn't matter how much wax or how much
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
biochemicals went into it. You want it to look perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think that there's areas where you want actually things to become a commodity. Like, food is a great example, actually. Like, I want everybody to eat and I want everybody to have access to good foods and like all of these different things. And so, in a space like that, like, I think there's a lot of value in kind of automating, through that process. I will say that, like, I do think from a consumer perspective, it'll be interesting to see like the consumer shifts to like oh, like I can go and buy this purse that they've made 3 million of and everybody
Mhm.
has, or I can buy this from the farmers market with the imperfect apples
Yeah.
and feel like I'm actually interacting with a human. And I think there'll be a lot more spaces like that where people kind of crave the imperfectness of interaction with others, and then also the goods that come from that too. So
I,
it's
I
kind
hope
of
so. I do hope so, and I have some hesitation because I think that what you're going to see is it's not going to probably happen in our generation. Things take
yeah.
they say things take 2 generations to really become something of normalcy, and what you're seeing now is that there's a shift in how we visualize things. You talked about earlier that before you could watch a video and trust it, knowing that,
Mhm.
well, if it was on video, a picture can be photoshopped, right? That was the big thing
Yep.
back in the day. It was like, oh, it was photoshopped. No one ever thought about applying photoshopped, the idea of photoshopping a image or a photo, and then
Mhm.
now taking that to a video.
Yep.
but but now we can say, oh man, we look at so many things, and they're getting good too. I mean,
Yeah.
some of the stuff is coming out, and I think it's great. I think they're creative. I sometimes I wonder, like, where do people find the time to do some of these videos? But I love it. I'm glad they probably don't have a job and they're just doing videos in their basement, because I love it. It's hilarious.
Well, I one thing. So this is interesting. Like you bring this up. Like, how do you feel about when the barrier to entry for any skill goes to relative zero, right? Because like you said, it used to be that you had to like if you think about the original Photoshop, it was literally like taking photos and making
Yes.
edits like to them, cutting
Yes.
things out, pasting it over, and then you know actually creating like the composite image. And then Photoshop came out and it lowered the barrier to entry for like the skill set it
Yep.
takes to do that. And then now a lot of these other tools, like I can take a great picture on my phone now and edit all the people
Right.
out of the image and all of these different things. So I think it's like a story of like the capability required to do things continues to trend to zero. And I'm interested like your thoughts on
Sure.
like how do you think about a world where like essentially anything becomes accessible because the barrier to entry as a result of technology is low.
Yeah, no, I'm actually glad you asked that, and it's something that I'm super passionate about. It's one of the reasons why I started my company, and it's because we're trying to redefine what human intelligence really means.
Mm,
And we talked about earlier, right before this call, actually, before we started the podcast, about that human intelligence and artificial intelligence is getting to 100%. So, to your point, it's getting to kind of a net zero when it comes to the skill set and the gaps that exist between what you would consider hard skills, right?
mm,
What I'm focused on is the soft skills, because things change, and I think what's the only constant is change itself, right? But I think that one thing that's interesting is human nature hasn't changed.
mhm,
Peter Schultz, the CEO of Porsche, said that he train skill, hire character,
mhm,
and that is one of our massive mottos that we follow in my company, because what we're trying to do is understand, okay, great, if everybody has the same skill set, because now you have the ability for technology enhancements and the capabilities are there where now you can just literally speak, you want something to be done and it's done. I mean, it's incredible that we're even having the conversation that's in we're living a reality that actually is true, right? We're not just talking about some Star Wars, Star Trek concept here. And I think that when you look at what that means, that most people, let's back it up and say 85%, there's a stat that says 85% of people that are working within a company do not know their vision. They don't know the vision of their company. They have no idea what the vision of the company is. That's a massive miss for companies, because now we're talking about someone, and you're saying, we understand, and one of the things that I try to educate people on is there is a huge identity crisis within our Western culture, but I think globally there's an identity crisis. When you ask somebody when you meet somebody, you always ask, "Hey, what's your name, and what do you do?" And when we start in that frame, it puts someone into well, if I don't do this, but I have this done for me because I don't know how to do it, or I'm an SME in this space. I can't imagine what doctors are thinking right now. I mean, they're probably celebrating the idea that there's you know AI that is able to detect cancer better than any doctor could
Yep.
in certain use cases right now. Not everything, but there is coming a long way, and I think that's going to be probably one of the most exciting things to look out for is healthcare in the next 5 years. I think healthcare is going to blow up in a major way. I think it's going to make everything accessible. I think that you're going to see things come across the aisle geopolitically, as well as just in our own U.S. Framework. You're going to see a lot of things that are coming up. It doesn't matter what side you're on. I think that the advancements in healthcare to be globally or nationally accessible to people. I have a small business.
Yeah.
When I was working at and I'm sure, it's a little bit different with you working on a startup versus just like your own business, but like insurance is expensive.
Yep.
Healthcare insurance is very, very expensive. And I was fortunate enough to have insurance throughout most of my career through working with some type of a form of agency or a larger company, and it was great. But there's a lot of people like me, especially in the small business world, a lot of the startups that don't have the access to that. And I think that when you look at that at scale, what you're looking at is the advancements and how it affects people. And when you look at that, you're saying, okay, great. So the skill, you don't maybe need the skill as a doctor anymore. But how many times have you met a doctor and you said, man, they had great bedside manner,
Yep.
right? Man, they were just nice to talk to
Mhm.
versus someone. Now, granted, if I have someone working on me, if I have a heart, open heart surgery, I probably don't care if the guy's an
Yeah.
asshole.
Yeah. Exactly.
If
Yeah.
he's the best,
Yeah.
then go
Absolutely.
ahead. Same thing like flying an airplane, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
flying an airplane and you're calling me names on my way on the plane, I could probably put it aside and just know that
Yep.
you are amazing at your job, and I'm going to trust you to do your job. But that's not the case for majority. Not a lot of people do not. I've worked with a lot of smart people in many different companies, and there's not a lot of people that fall into that category of, hey, I don't care how you act towards me, I want to be on your team.
Yeah.
Usually it's okay, there's a give and take. But
Yep.
what happens when we take away the ability to fly an airplane very well? What
Yeah.
happens when we take away the ability to understand graphs and charts and detect cancer, and we kind of take that and say, look, we don't need to do that anymore, we're going to offset that through AI enhancements and technology advancements? Now you gotta be someone that someone
It's
likes, right?
worthwhile.
You
Yeah. Well,
have to be you have to be the nice person. And I think those soft skills then become that much more important and more in the forefront. And I don't think that companies are doing enough. And this is one of my biggest things right now is I'm trying to educate and help companies collect people data. They've got to
mm,
understand their people. They've got to get data around their people. I've talked about this in one of the other podcasts around that people will give more information to social sites than they will their own companies. I think
Yeah.
that's a miss. I think
Yep.
that's a trust issue that companies are not speaking up to, and they I think the ones that are listening, they don't know how to respond and execute in an effective way that allows everybody to feel that they're coming across authentic, because you're talking about large companies that there's no way that the leadership is going to be liked by everybody in the organization. But
Yep.
if they have a vision, they have a strategy, and they relate that, then now they can have alignment. I always
Hmm.
talked about myself being a digital chiropractor, because it's really about aligning the people, technology, and strategies together. Because if you
Hmm.
have that alignment, now if someone says, look, I don't align with your values, I don't align with your mission, I don't align with your vision, that's fine. Go find another company that does
Yep.
and align with theirs. And that's completely fine. But I think that if we have that people data, we have data on our accounting, we have data on our machines, we have data on our operations, we have data on everything else. We don't have data on our people. And we've got to change that.
Yeah, well, and you know what's interesting too? So we started doing some research into like graph databases and
Mm-hmm.
just relational mapping of things in an environment. And I 100% agree with you. I think actually, I was talking about like the people will pay more for things made by people.
Yeah.
I think that's the same kind of thing that you're getting to, which is like people miss the human touch of like actually building a relationship with somebody, or enjoying the company of another person. And that's where like I struggle a little bit with some of the relational AI stuff, where people are like, oh yeah, you're gonna have an AI girlfriend or wife or whatever in the future. I'm like, man, i
Crazy.
don't i don't know about that. Like I don't know that I can get on board, because of the fact that I enjoy kind of the human interaction as
But
much as I.
you can see why there are certain types of people with certain types of personalities and certain environments that speak to.
Mhm.
I mean, if I not to, I don't know, maybe you should go this direction. I think it's actually worth talking about. I
Mhm.
think that when you look at what has been probably the biggest impact and most influence on technology in our, from analog to digital, has been the porn industry.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I mean, the reason we have VHS, the reason we have Blu-ray is because of the porn industry.
Yep.
And when you look at some of the things that AI is doing in that space, and especially in like the Asian space, you got like I think there was a guy that married some humanoid AI
Yeah.
or
Some
something,
AI.
right? Like, yeah, it's crazy. But when you look at that, when you look at that space and what they're doing, they have a huge influence on the technology use of that. And there's a reason why, and I can't remember the names of it. Obviously, because I don't use them. But there are some apps out there that let you, like, to your point, like have like somewhere you can chat with, and it they
Yeah.
become like your pen pal type of thing. But it's not so friendly, right? And it's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
more sexualized. And I think that there's obviously a space for that. There's a need for that. Talk about like Maslow's hierarchy, right, of the needs,
Yep.
right? And you start looking at that in relation to what we're doing with AI, and it's like, well, yeah, you still have to meet those needs.
Mhm.
And so now it becomes to, well, something's going to take its place. And
Yep.
if someone, energy, clean energy, oil and gas, whatever
Mhm.
your take on that, when you look at what is the biggest driver to relieving a culture and a country from poverty, it is crude oil.
Yep.
It is
Energy
oil and
necessity.
gas, right? That is the easiest and cheapest way to get them out of poverty.
Mhm.
But then you look at the U.S. and Western cultures, and you look at all the green renewables that we're doing, and it's like, well, that's great, but because we have a choice.
Yeah.
But when
Yep.
you going back to are you taking away choice when you automate? Because I think it's all connected. You have to go back to where when someone was telling me that when they look at giving having conversations with ChatGPT or any kind of other one of the AI chatbots, what they always look for is they try to prompt it to where the AI chatbot gives them three choices. So
That's
they don't just
interesting.
ask for a question. They
Mhm.
say, here's the question, give me options. And part of me thinks, okay, well, that's interesting because now you're giving information, but you're relying on yourself to then have discernment to make that final choice.
Mhm.
So I think it's important that we build choice into it. You can go, could go back to like the Matrix and the kind of concepts that really has. I think it's interesting, but I think it's relevant, and I think that's interesting that we're talking about something that we maybe 10 years ago we had no idea we'd be talking about in a reality.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too on a psychological level. There's a lot of research where like if humans have essentially more than five options, then your ability to actually pick the best option is
Yeah.
actually significantly limited.
Yep.
Whereas like if you have, pick the best of five options, people can do a pretty good job. And
And it's
so
always like it's either two, three, or four, right? I mean, it's hardly
yeah.
ever when you give them that many options. There was a study that was done around a bakery, and they decided, and this was a sales marketing study, and what they realized that if you were in a bakery and you put all of your super sweet stuff in the front when they first walk in, and
Mhm.
then put your not so sweet stuff. So you have your cupcakes and your cakes and all the candies and stuff. And then as you get closer to the register, you put your cookies, you put some of the like the pound cakes, the less sweet stuff. And what they
Mhm.
realize is that people say no, 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 no. And then they reward themselves for saying no to the sweet stuff, and then they still get something.
Pound cake.
And
So
so
funny.
so part of those choices sometimes I feel like um, can be the whole the coffee cups and the small, medium, large, and they
Yeah,
price it to a point where it's like, well, if you took the medium out and you said, hey, I've only got a $3 small or a 450 large, well, that's $1.50 difference. But what happens now if I put a $4 medium in there? Well, now the
yeah,
large makes sense, right? And so I think what happens is we can actually get to a point where does choice become just an illusion of choice,
yeah,
to
absolutely.
get an outcome that is more efficient for AI enhancements.
Yeah, well, yeah. So there's a book called Predictably Irrational. Have you
Okay,
ever read that
I
book?
have not read it. No.
So it's very good. Yeah,
Okay,
so would highly recommend it. But
awesome.
it talks exactly about these types of things where it's like people think that they are rational beings that are just walking around and like making
Yeah,
calculations and doing. That is not the case at all.
we are
And
creatures of
actually,
habit.
yeah, well, and actually, one of the concerns that I have on the AI side is that like we already talk about the microcosms that we're in with the algorithms that run our news feeds and all kinds of other things. Imagine that algorithm is it's across every modality or every tool that you interact with in your life, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really tailored to giving you the thing that you want, but the thing that you want may not actually be based in reality. And so
Yes.
I think there's like the companies like Anthropic and OpenAI and all these groups that are working on this, like this is not a trivial challenge,
Yeah.
like you have to yeah, like imagine that somebody talks about flat Earth theory or whatever. Like how do you
And they're
how do
still
you
out there. They're still out there.
yeah,
That's
yeah, absolutely.
wild, man. It's wild.
Well, and from a model perspective, it's like how do you like have a productive conversation without like making them feel bad about themselves, but also like trying to like hey, here maybe like how would gravity work if the world was flat, and like what are ways that you can guide the conversation without actually telling somebody that they're wrong. And
See, I don't
so
know though. I don't know. I disagree with that because I feel like and I'm very goal oriented. This is probably just some of my A personality coming out, but I I always struggle with the idea of trying because you have to be liked um to be followed.
yeah,
I talked about this a while back, and I'm actually doing some research on this right now. But the idea of like leadership and what leadership means, and at the most simplistic version of what a leader is someone that has a following. You don't have to be a good leader to be a bad leader. Um, you just have to be you have someone that follows you to be a
yep,
leader, right? I mean, there's and so when I think about what leadership means, is getting people to follow you. And when you have someone to follow you, you have to have some type of maybe like, but I think it's more relatability than anything else. I think we substitute that with thinking that we need people to like us. We don't need people to like us. We need people to relate to us. And
well, so
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I agree with you, but I
Okay.
think the challenge for these companies is that they're selling a product.
They
In
are.
order to
They're
sell a
trying to sell it
product,
to everybody. And the
yeah.
problem is they don't need to sell it to everybody. And there's being bigger is not everything. And I think that's one of the shifts that I'm seeing that I think that is becoming unrelatable. And I think that's why you see the shift of people leaving big companies and going to smaller companies is because they're starting to get so disconnected from what they relate to. They relate to the mission. They relate to that, hey, I understand that a big ship takes a long time to move, but once it gets to shore, it has a huge impact. I understand that.
Mhm.
But I also think that most people are saying, you know what though? Like, companies are meant to last decades, centuries even. We're not. And so we have very limited time as a person to have a huge impact. And you look at some of these people, I mean, Steve Jobs, he died way before his time, right? But
Yep.
the amount of impact that he had on everybody, on the world, is incredible. And I think that you're starting to see that because AI has enabled people to do more with less, we're
Mhm.
now seeing the shift where, man, these companies are spending so much money that it's just wasteful.
Mhm.
And they're not even talking about, and you could talk about any big company, but I mean, you look at like the fashion industry, right? How they just burn all these, like, two, three, $4,000 purses because, well, they didn't sell them that year and they're not going to give them to anybody else.
Yep.
And it's just like, wow, like, people, I think there's a lot of people that just don't relate to that. So I think that when you look at, like, from a leadership perspective, you have to be relatable, and relatable means that you may not always be liked.
Mhm.
And I think that we have to be okay with that, because then you get people that are authentic and that are authentically in your circle. And now you can have a greater impact when you have people. I'd rather have 5 great friends that I can call all day
Yep.
long than 200 friends I never talk to that just, I'm connected to online. And I think that we're
Yep.
starting to kind of see that play out in reality. At least I hope so. And I think that you're starting to see that. But I think people are uncertain because they don't. We're trained to be liked. We're trained to have that need, right? That sociability, and that social requirement that says we need to be liked. But I think it's that we're misinterpreting it. We need to be relatable, and we need people to relate to us, and we need to be okay with that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So relatable leads to relationships, which leads to
Like,
all those things. So
yeah,
yeah.
it's the outcome. It's not what you start with. You don't start with, like, I didn't start, we didn't start communicating and whatnot because all of a sudden I just saw you and I liked you. No, like, we connected, we had conversations, like, this is great.
Yep.
We have some relatability,
Hmm.
and now you have like, right? And I think that we're missing. People don't want to put the effort in. I always talk about discretionary effort. That if you want to be better than most people in your circle, all you have to do is 2%,
Yep.
2% more than anybody else. It's not a lot. And you can become greater at whatever you're doing. But most people don't want to take that extra effort.
It's interesting too. Like, I don't think people understand the compounding effect of that.
Sure.
Right. Like, if you're 1% better every day, I mean, that's
Man.
365%. At
Yes.
the end of the year, that's a big difference, right? So, yeah,
Yes.
I love what you're saying there. I think that that's really important, and I agree. Like, from a leadership perspective, the relatability, and I think authenticity is probably what leads to being relatable.
Oh, sure it
But
does.
that authenticity aspect of things, I think, is incredibly important, which is like, hey, like, we don't have to agree, but I care about you and
Yeah.
I want to make sure that you're okay. I want you to know transparently where I'm at, but, like, we don't have to agree for us to be, compatible, or for us to be friends. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really important, thing as well. I mean, we've
Yeah.
disagreed on this podcast, right? As we're talking back and forth. And
Yeah, I
I
agree. I agree that you have to find one. You have to be okay with, well, one. Let me back up. You have to know your values. You
mhm,
have to know what you stand for.
yeah,
If I always say, if you either know, you either believe what you know, or you believe what you're told.
yeah,
And I think that we live in a society right now where, and a culture that we're being told a lot of things,
mhm,
but we don't take enough time to say, wait, what do I know from my experiences, from the people that I surround myself with, my, obviously considering your bias. And I think that's an important piece of it. I think people always try to take bias out of it. I said, no, 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 keep your bias in, just be aware of your bias, and then
mhm,
make sure people are also aware of that, because that's authentic. If you're
yeah,
taking everything out and you're some, like, empty shell because you're waiting for, again, you want to be liked, so you're like, oh, whatever you like, I'm good with, and you artificially create a connection there. It may not happen right away, but it's gonna be sought out eventually, and you're gonna be found out. I think that at that point, then it's really hard to walk back. And so I think that you have to understand your values. You have to then speak your values, and you have to be okay with it. And I think you can disagree with somebody and still be kind.
yeah. Oh,
That's
for
a
sure.
that's a missing piece, I think, to a lot of conversations that end up going sideways. It's like, wait, like, it's okay. Like, I understand that sometimes it gets heated. Sometimes, you're passionate about certain things, but you can still be kind to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's a prerequisite, right? To
Sure.
being the type of person who like you want to follow is you're not going to agree with everybody. Like there's no world in which you can agree with everybody, but to your point, like if you have a foundational set of virtues, that you live your life by, or values, or a vision for a company, right?
Yeah.
As long as people align to the core set of values that everybody is coming together around,
Yeah.
you can disagree on the periphery.
Correct.
I like chocolate ice cream. You might like vanilla. Who knows? And I
I'm a
think there's
Neapolitan guy. I like everything.
okay, all right, gotcha. Yeah. So I mean, I 100% agree with you, and I think from a from a future perspective, I love I love your thought that the kind of human touch and the relatability and the actual human nature of the interactions that we have are what's going to be important,
Yeah.
because I think that's all we really can do in a world where everything technically becomes more capable than we are.
Yeah. So what I know we're kind of getting too close to the time, and I would be curious on, you know, how do you see that playing out in the real world though? Because we know we need it. We talk about it all the time, and we don't talk about it all the time, and we
Mhm.
should be. How do you get to a position where you're having to rewire? It's easier to rewire a model than it is our brains.
Yep.
How do you rewire companies and leadership to respond to this major shift that is, we're literally the tip of the iceberg right now, and some of the companies that are responding to this and seeing this human nature, this the humanistic approach to technology. I say the technology last approach is kind of what I use. I'd say, technology be the last thing you look at, not the first. It should
Mhm.
always be people, process, and then technology. And really, technology is, at the end of the day, it's just a application of knowledge, right? So
Yep.
it's, not machines and robots and et cetera, et cetera. But I would, because of your involvement in the manufacturing space, and in the kind of factory role, smart factories, smart manufacturing, those kind of things are kind of taking up and really becoming huge in the next. I mean, they've already started becoming huge, but I think in the next 2 years, you're going to see it kind of get into a level of maturity that we've never seen before.
Mhm.
When we look at that, how do we then change the mindset and the thinking, and whether it's education or whether it's just getting in there and doing it, getting our hands dirty? How do we get people to respond and say, yes, we need soft skills more than hard skills, we need to put focus on this, we need to get the data, and we need to work with companies and people that can help us do that?
Yeah. So I mean, I have a kind of a fundamental belief that um, flexibility, like in a space that's moving really fast, flexibility is the best trait that you can have, right?
Yeah.
Or adaptability maybe is another.
Agility, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, proxy to that. So
Yeah.
in that world, I actually think that it's funny, like if you think about corporate manufacturing, or like I guess any kind of corporate entity, you have this kind of thought process of like, we're going to put together a 5-year plan. We're going to do all these different things, and it's like the idea of a 5-year plan is kind of funny to me, like at this point, because it's like,
Do companies even do 5 years plan? I mean, almost like 1 or 3 year plans is kind of the
yeah,
norm, I feel like, these days, right? Yeah.
yeah. Well, and
Like, do you know what
so
your company's gonna look like in 3 years? No.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
yeah, 100%.
And so like I think, but if you look at the way that a lot of businesses are structured too, there's a lot of like, an example of this is there are companies where it's like you could come in at engineer one, and then you become engineer two, and then you
Sure.
become like like there's a career path that you
It's
can
a
follow.
ladder you climb.
Yeah, I think businesses should look at people more as like a flexible element of their business, and so they can kind of flow to the things that are interesting to them, and the things that really where they can provide the most value, because in general, when people go to work, they don't want to go to work and just sit there all day. Like they
Mhm.
actually want to do something and feel like their time's valuable and all that stuff. And so
Yeah.
I think a big piece of this is how do you allow people to actually flow to things that are interesting to them and that provide value in the business, and then you build structure to support that, as opposed to building structure that's rigid, because I think those rigid structures break in a world of AI, when
Mhm.
who knows what jobs will or will not be here in 5 years.
Yeah, no,
What are
100%. Well, and that's what we actually do that. So we actually will do cognitive ability, behavioral traits, and
mm,
motivation interests, and we do these assessments as benchmarks for companies. So we come in and we will benchmark the people that already are working in those roles. And the reason we do that is because we can understand from performance. Okay, well, are you actually high performing or are you low performing? And depending on if you're high performing or low performing, these are the models that are created based on your psychometric data. And then we
wow.
can take those and use those to hire people within those roles. Now, what's interesting about that is not only are you able to understand the people that are already in those roles, the people of how to hire for cultural fit and your emotional intelligence and other psychometrics, but you're also able to say, okay, from a project perspective, if this person now has been um, uh, I guess not replaced, but has been supplemented by AI. And now instead of them taking 40 hours to do their work, they're taking 20 hours to do their work. What happens today is you have a company that says, hey, this person has 20 hours availability.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter about how productive they are. They don't say, "Oh, well, you're working now for you were doing 40, now you're 20. Hey, go take off the 20 hours and we'll just keep on paying you the same." They don't do that, right? They say, "We
Yeah.
need to fill this because we're paying you for 40." And it
Mhm.
becomes this availability versus productivity. I say like there's roles that you have to have availability. 911 callers, they
Yeah.
have to have availability. It doesn't matter how productive they are. They have to be there to answer the phone. A project manager or a product manager could be more productive and they could say, hey, well, just why should I be, why should I be punished because I did my job better and faster than
Mhm.
somebody else doing the same job that I have? Shouldn't I be rewarded by saying, hey, if I do in 30 hours, I can take that 10 hours and go do something?
Yeah.
Or do I have an environment in a company that says, hey, if you've got your work done, now go innovate,
Yeah. I
go
was gonna say,
go play with something, or go find someone that you want to shadow and learn what they do. Like have some type of roles within organizations that lead you that. But what they do is they say this person's available, I have this that I need to do, and you're going to do that without qualifiers. They may
yep.
not be the perfect person to do that role. They may hate doing that role, but
Yep.
because they're available, they're going to be the first one to get voluntold that
Mhm.
this is your new thing. And I think what happens is from a project level in the psychometrics, we can actually say, okay, look, we have this many projects, and these are the type of people that would be really good at these
Yep.
projects. We have this many people in our organization. These are the type of people you have access to. Now let's align them, right? Digital chiropractor, right? Let's align them to the organizational vision to make sure that you have higher productivity, higher performance, and higher morale. People are going to love what they do when they actually love what they do. It's
Absolutely.
very simple.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
think to your point, but my question, I think, just to kind of reiterate that question, how do you get people to say, we know that that makes sense? How do they then just do it? Because I think you're getting, at least I'm seeing a lot of resistance where people are saying, we got HR kind of does that, or
mhm.
our ops, they kind of know their they manage their teams, they know their teams, or and there's just a lot of disconnect within the different departments. And so how as an organization, how do you see maybe AI being involved in that, or a person, or how do you get traction enough to say this is the norm and we get away from that productivity over availability?
Yeah, it's a tough it's a tough thing because again, like I think it's going to be multiple things. I think you have to have a leadership alignment that like the world is changing and we have to rethink about like how we actually structure and manage these things.
Yeah.
I think there's like a alignment on for the employees themselves, like hey, if you're able to get like how do you think about new tools in the space of your work? And then like how do you talk with your boss about these conversations
Yeah.
where it's like hey, like I'm doing this and it's an hour now instead of 2 hours. Can I spend that extra hour? And I think coming to them with a plan of like, hey, I'd love to spend the hour that I automated away doing X that will provide value. I think those kinds of conversations need to happen as well. So I
Yeah.
think it's like a top down and a bottoms up thing that we'll
Meet
have
in the
to
middle. Yeah.
at the same time. I did want to tell you one of my mentors earlier in my career, he used to say that availability is not a skill set, and I love that
So
because
true, man. I do love that. I'm gonna
yeah,
I'll take that, man. I'm gonna use
yeah,
that. I love that. Availability is not a skill set. That's and interesting enough. You talk about hard skills versus soft skills, and I think we should identify them as that. I think we need to
Yep.
identify them as skills in general, and is what the qualifiers for the job need to change.
Mhm.
Job descriptions you see, and I was talking to a recruiter the other day, and they were talking to me about how the with working with HR, they always take a job description of what the person's actually going to do, and they'll
Mhm.
just post it, or they'll take a really hyped up, really sexy looking job description, and then it's completely different than what the
Oh,
job
sure.
description is when they actually go for it. And she said, look, a job description online posted on LinkedIn or Indeed or whatever, that is a sales pitch.
Yep.
But your job description on what you do is actually what you're based on from a performance perspective. And so
Mm.
there has to be a connection between those two, and it has to be communicated properly to the individuals, but they can't be in misalignment.
Yeah,
They,
absolutely.
if you read one, you can read it all, man, that sounds great. When you read the next one that actually is what you're being performed on, it shouldn't sound that much different. It's going to be a lot more technical, sure. It's not going to sound with all the adjectives, et cetera, whatnot. But it shouldn't be misaligned. And I think what you see is that we're misaligning some of the hard skills with what we really mean is we want a nice person to work with. We want
Yep.
someone that fits in our culture, but that doesn't come across in our job descriptions, right? Companies put job descriptions down and they don't look at those as a defining skill. They look
Mhm.
at it as an add-on. Like, you
Yeah.
need to know this, this, and this. And oh, by the way, when we interview you, you got to be a nice person.
Yeah.
And we can't do that. We have to now shift how we're doing our job descriptions to make sure that the skills are the skills, regardless of if they're hard or soft. And I think that they're going to be more soft than hard, moving forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, yeah, it's like hire for the values and teach the skills type of thing.
100%. Yep.
That's incredibly important. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love what you guys are doing. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm anxious to see what you guys have coming out next. So I know, as we kind of close, is there? I love to just get some advice, and maybe tell some people about what you feel strongly about. That's going to be the biggest thing to look for in our upcoming, say, year 2025. What are something that people need to keep their eye open for? What do they need to keep their tabs on?
Yeah, so I'll give an answer that pertains to AI, obviously, because we're talking
Heck
about this.
yeah, let's do it.
Uh, I think businesses, again, like we were talking about, environments built for people, et cetera. If you want to be able to effectively use AI for a lot of different tasks, then I think we need to start thinking differently about how we document things too.
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
know about you, but like I've looked through tons of procedures and you have like nested tables and all kinds of things
Yeah.
that are really ugly and hard to use. So I think as we're creating new documentation for people and for AI,
Wait,
we'll
people
have
still have documentation? Wait.
yeah. Well, we'll see in the future, right? But um, I do think that like companies as a whole should think about every piece of data that gets generated as an opportunity to interact with an AI around that. And so, in order to be able to use that data, it has to be in a format that makes sense and a bunch of other things. So, I think data. I know it's not the sexiest
It's
answer,
the
but
outputs inputs though, right? I mean, it's as simple as inputs outputs, and I think that that's what you're getting at, right? It's that you have. I mean, that's one of the issues we have with AI today is that most people are trying to use it in a small capacity, and AI really how it excels is through big, huge data sets, right? And so yeah, I think what you're basically saying, and if I understand this correctly, is you're saying that every single piece of data has the ability to reach its highest potential, but only through AI. And if we consider that in the thought process of how we perform those inputs, then the
Mhm.
outputs can be so much more usable, more
Absolutely.
value, stronger
Well,
of a use case for moving
everybody
forward.
wants everybody wants an AI assistant that will do things for them. But like if you ask them like, well, how's your documents? They're like, well, I have stuff in a binder that I've written
I
or
know,
on a notepad on my
it's all
desk or
tribal knowledge,
whatever.
man.
Yeah, and so my point in saying this is get it somewhere that's like a structured place to actually store everything, and then as you're actually building out more complex documents, think about it from the context of what an AI can read, so that in the future you don't have to go back and rework all of those documents. You can just feed them into a rag or whatever, and
Yeah.
be able to get the right answer. So.
And it should be able to self-update, right? I mean, if you're doing it all right, then it should be self-updating and whatnot as you go. So yeah, Dane, awesome show, man. It's been a great just conversation with you. I always love talking with you in general, so I'm sure we'll be in touch before the new year. But thanks again for your time today. I appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome, man. Thanks.
Take care.
You too.